Hi, in this video we are going to look at some of the practical examples of non-local scope. So as we all know, functions defined inside another function can reference variable from its enclosing scope, just like functions can reference variables from the global scope. Let's look at an example. Let me define a function outer, and in that I am going to define a variable x. Then let me define another function in it by the name inner, and then tries to print the value of x. Then let's call inner function, then outer function, which will actually define and call the inner function, and then the inner function is going to print the value of x. So what is happening here is the inner function is printing the value of x, but the x is not defined in its local scope. So it looks into its enclosing scope, and the enclosing scope is outer's scope. So x is defined in the outer scope, and it is going to print that x value. Now, in fact, any level of nesting is supported, since Python just keeps looking in enclosing scope until it finds what it needs, or if it fails to find it by the time it finishes looking in the built-in scope, it will raise runtime error. So let's look at an example of inner function. Let me define the outer func first, then let's define a variable x. Let me define one more function, one more inner function, so that you can see that it looks at any level of nesting. Let me try to print the value of x here, and now let's call these functions, and then let's call outer function, so that it will define and call both inner 1 and inner 2. So you can see that we are able to print the value of x even if the x is not defined in the local scope of inner 2. It is able to find in its enclosing scope. Here that enclosing scope is outer func scope, where it is defined. Now if we also assign a variable in our local function, it is considered as a part of local scope and mask the enclosing scope variable name. For example, let me show it by example. Let's define a function outer, and let me give it a variable name x, and then let me define another function in it, and where I am also defining the x variable. So now you can see that we have two functions, and in both the functions we have defined a variable x. So what is going to happen is x in the inner function is going to mask the enclosing scope variable x. Let me print it. So you can see that it actually not modifying the value of outer function. So if you want to modify that outer function x variable in the inner function, you need to tell Python that you want to modify the non-local variable x, then only it is going to modify its enclosing variable x. Now if you execute this, you can see that in the outer function, if we print the value of x, it is modified by the inner func. So this can happen at any level of nesting. So if let me define a function here in which I'm going to define a variable x, and let me define two more functions. Now let's use a non-local keyword in order to access its enclosing variable x, then modify its value by mukul, and then let's call inner2 and now inner1. Let's print the value of x. Now let's call outer, which will basically define both the functions and then call. You can see that at this level of nesting we are able to modify the non-local scope variable. If the Python doesn't find a variable in the function enclosing scope, it will give you an error. For example, let me define a function outer. Before that, let me define a global variable x. Now let's access that global variable, then let's modify that global variable. Okay, now let's define another function inner, in which I am going to access the non-local scope variable x, and then will modify its value. And then call inner. Then at the end we will call the outer function, which will basically define the inner function and then call it. So this function is giving us an error. Why? So if you look here in the code, it is trying to access non-local x variable, but in its enclosing scope there is no non-local x variable defined, but the global x variable is defined in the outer function. But in the outer function there is no local x variable defined, because of which it is not able to find any x variable in its enclosing scope, and it is going to give us an error, no binding for non-local x found. That's it for today's video. Have a nice day.